Hello everyone and welcome to the EDRM webinar series. Today's webinar topic is the state of the industry, TAR and analytics, the end of year report, and is sponsored by Ipro. My name is Tom Gelbman, co-founder of EDRM, and I will be moderating this webinar. Before we get going, I'd like to cover a couple of housekeeping items for our attendees. First of all, if you look on your screen, if you look in the lower right-hand corner, you see a little box with arrows. That is the icon for expanding to full screen. And if you wish to see it full screen, just click on that. If you want to go back to a normal screen, just hit escape. If you have any difficulties during the webinar, you see in the upper right-hand corner a little question mark. That is a icon you can use for help. Generally, what we've seen is some folks have sound issues. Usually, our experience has been it's a local issue. So if you do have some sound issues, best to log out, log back in, and that should correct the problem. You'll also see some tabs at the top of your screen. One of the most important tabs is Ask a Question. We like to hear from you throughout the webinar. Ask questions early, ask them often, and that'll help guide our discussion. We also have a Rate This button, so at the end of the webinar, before you leave, if you would give us a rating of how you found this webinar. There is a 1 to 5 star rating. Of course, we'd like 5 stars for everybody, but also more importantly, there's an opportunity to provide comments, and we do appreciate your feedback to help us improve in the future. There will be a recording of this webinar posted on the EDRM, Ipro, and BrightTalk websites at the conclusion. And that's about it. So I'd like to get into this and introduce our panelists, or have them introduce themselves. Tammy and Greg, go for it.
Thanks, Tom. My name is Greg Buckles, and I am the founder of the EDJ Group. And I've been in the e-discovery industry for over 25 years, started in law enforcement as a CSI a long time ago, and have spanned pretty much almost every role within the e-discovery world, including law firms, software design, and most recently with the EDJ Group, we were functioning as market analysts for the e-discovery industry. And today we'll be covering the research that I've just completed in 2015 on analytics and predictive coding and technology-assisted review in the legal space. My co-presenter today from Ipro is Tammy Doss. Tammy, why don't you give a little introduction for yourself?
Thanks, Greg. Hello, everyone. I'm Tammy Doss. I am the Vice President of Sales Operations for Ipro, based out of Tempe, Arizona. I've been in the e-discovery industry for about 14 years, a little over 14 years, and started out on the service bureau side and transitioned over the last few years into software and more on the software and technology side. So really looking forward to this webinar today.
Great. Thanks, Tammy. So Tom has already covered a bit of our housekeeping rules and information. The copy of this presentation and a copy of my analytic report, the raw survey results, and pretty much anything else you need out of our research library is available from me. My email and Tammy's email will be available on our Q&A slide at the back end. Just send us a note, and we're happy to send you a copy of everything. So today, what we're going to try to cover is we're going to redefine a little bit of analytics, the usage cases, predictive coding, only in the context to make sure that as we talk about the survey results and the information I got back on my interviews, that you understand when we use a term, what we're using that term for. Talk a little bit about the myths and the barriers to adoption that we have out in the industry today. Specifically, I'm covering today my 2015 survey. It was a fairly short survey, only ran for about 30 days. We had 41 respondents on the survey. This was an update to my 2014 research. Did about a 6-month research project in 2014 to really nail down what was going on with predictive coding in the real world and get some hard numbers on it. And there were some open questions from the 2014 research that I decided were worth going back and doing, running another survey on and getting really specific into, how many cases are people really using these technologies on, and what parts of the cases are they using them on, and not just asking the big broad question of, have you tried predictive coding? So I'll dig in a little bit to my research methodology. I conducted 15 interviews this last couple months, done briefings with most of the major analytic providers, and from that, talk a little bit about where do we see the market going in the next year. And we'll wrap up, Tammy and I will wrap up taking your questions, and we have a lot of open material to talk about, so probably the last 15 minutes will be geared around Q&A. So from there, moving into when we're talking about analytics and the use of advanced technology to manipulate the data, not just extract the to, from, and CCs from collections and discovery response, we're seeing 3 primary consumers or 3 primary areas that analytics are being used for. The enterprise or the corporations are just barely starting to use analytics in info governance. Microsoft has made a certain level of informatics and analytics available through their Delve features in their Office 365 and their on-premise versions. And as of a week ago, Office 365 and their E5 level license, that's about $33 or $35 per month, has made Equivio available for those users. So we now have a certain level of analytics and even potentially predictive coding features available to the market from the actual information or the enterprise level. You can also see some of these examples of usage cases that were talked about during my interviews and in survey results. From the provider side, we are primarily seeing analytics used in processing. They're primarily using them to deduplicate, to do near deduplication, to do metrics analysis of the systems or the data coming through, profiling, categorization. And our focus today principally is on the review side of the application. So law firms and to a small extent corporations are using these machine learning technologies and the clustering systems to power predictive coding or technology-assisted review, but they're not necessarily using them in the way that we thought. So, Tammy, let's talk a little bit about predictive coding and have you give the audience a little bit of a walkthrough on just the overview or workflow on that.
Sure. So, we listed here a couple of models. So the Ipro, we obviously have technology-assisted review capabilities and analytics built into our Eclipse review tool. And our process is not dissimilar to that of the EDRM's computer-assisted review reference model, which is shown here. And it's a very simple overview concept of the fact that, post-processing and in preparation for review, folks are utilizing the capabilities in the review tool to cluster documents, pull samples, random samples from a number of different clusters and get a really great cross-section of what their data population is, and then perform a review and make decisions on documents and submit that, sample set or seed set to the system to begin training the system on what's important for a particular case, what is relevant versus non-relevant, and maybe some other factors, to prioritize a review, to help segregate pieces and parts of the population to provide specific reviewers with specific document sets, and so on. And so it's a process of sampling, coding, categorizing, then analyzing the results. There's a series of reporting, analyzing the results, and then doing it again. And then at some point, a certain level of confidence is achieved. In which case, the sampling and the training piece would stop, and the results would be applied to the entire population. And then there could be other workflows that play into that, depending on what the goal is. And so throughout this discussion, I think that's something I'm going to probably talk about quite a bit and even have a few questions about for you, Greg, is the goals of using this technology.
So Tammy, when I did my 2014 research, I spent a lot of time trying to break down the different approaches to that a customer could take machine learning and apply to the whole. The basic problem is the classic retrieval process. How do I retrieve what's relevant and exclude what's not? And Ipro's approach or system is one of those where essentially what you're doing is training the system to be able to help you categorize and to help group things. We have also seen some techniques or approaches. The continuous active learning approach is one that assumes that every potentially relevant email is going to be reviewed, but that the system will try to serve up to you the most relevant, the things that match your training system the best as quickly as possible until you reach the point where you're going through more and more items and none of them are relevant and you decide to stop at that point. And then there are also approaches which are the recommendation approaches. So we are seeing some of the systems out there don't try to create necessarily a prediction workflow. Instead, they let you organize your data as you will, but they track your decisions, and as you encounter new items in your review, the system itself will, either with an icon or with a weighting or a ranking, it'll try to tell you how it thinks based on your prior decisions that you should tag this particular item. So there are many different approaches, and there are many different pieces to it. The focus for my research was really trying to figure out, with several other surveys having come in the last year, all of them agreeing that we have roughly about 70 to 75% of the consumers out there have tried predictive coding. The question is how much of those, what portion of those cases that these users have, did they just try it once, or are they trying to use it on all of theirs? And so research-wise, my 2014 research, I had 71 respondents, but I actually
not sure what that's all about.
I also updated my briefings with the providers, specifically focused on trying to gather from them what were they seeing from the market and in their sales cycles, and how were they trying to change their predictive coding systems to better meet the demands for customers who tried the Generation 1 technologies and were demanding different or better or different usage cases. They wanted to use it outside of just the review process. So that's
Greg?
my basic. Yes, Tom.
Yeah. We do have a question.
Sure.
What kind of results and approaches are you seeing on TAR projects? And are you seeing more judgmental approaches or more pure statistical sampling? I guess that goes for both Greg and for Tammy.
Yep. Tammy, why don't you talk for a sec about, I know you were talking earlier about a case that you just helped wrap up. Why don't you give a little bit of an overview on that, because that will give some idea of the results that you were able to achieve on the upstream side.
Sure. So first of all, the answer is the very definitive answer of it depends. And so we are.
I think we have a slide on that.
It depends, but we are seeing a lot of I mean, it really does depend on the goals. So I mentioned that earlier regarding the goals. So if it depends on what the use case is and what the goals are of the review. But for an example, and Greg kind of mentioned this. So in some of your surveys, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Greg, but you were really specifically asking, if people are performing reviews without counsel, actually reviewing every document and for in terms of relevancy and privilege decisions. But for a particular case that we just finished, it kind of falls into that very small percentage of the population. I think that as we dive into the results here, that what you found is not dissimilar to some of the reporting I've heard as well, and even what we've seen, that the majority of matters do not use this type of technology, and it has had slow adoption, but it is catching on. And so one particular case that we have been in progress with a group that's using our technology, and there's a review team involved, and it's basically there's two counsel, the co-counsel working on the case, and it's roughly, these are rough numbers, it was about 5 million documents. And privilege was suppressed up, kind of earlier on in the process because they used keywords to identify privileged documents and suppress those prior to any of the technology-assisted review process. But ultimately, one of the two firms was all about using technology-assisted review, and the other one said, no, we want to do a linear review. So they sort of set down different paths on the same set of documents. And so about 5 million docs total, and the one firm that was doing the linear review, I think, got through about 350,000 in their process, and it took 100 reviewers, and it was a little over a month, I believe. And the other team started the process of categorizing documents, clustering, categorizing. They started with a seed set, sample 1,200 and some odd documents, and continued to sample. And then I think it was around 5,200 documents where they stopped training the system and ultimately applied the results to roughly 4.7 million documents. And throughout this time, they're in touch with the other counsels doing the linear review, and they did some QC. They did a lot of validation testing, by the way. This was not blind, apply these results and move on, but a lot of validation testing, a lot of QC passes, a lot of different sampling across the different types of issues that they were working on. And what they found when comparing the 350,000 roughly that were manually reviewed and doing samples on that in comparison to the same documents where the computer, the technology-assisted review process provided the coding, and comparing those two, they found that the machine learning was the same or better even than the manual. And so they were very comfortable, this particular firm, and based on their goals and what they needed to do, the two firms abandoned the manual process and we're very comfortable with moving on and using the technology. But again, I mean, there are multiple scenarios, and Greg, you and I have had previous discussions where we talk about, how privilege is determined and so on, but in this case, it wasn't part of that process.
Yep. So I heard quite a few essentially kind of case studies in the interviews in which the practitioners would say, we had to use predictive coding or something like it because of a time constraint or because of the raw volume, and there was no way to tackle it manually. There was no budget to tackle it manually. The stories around when do you decide to use this really did circulate around essentially when they were forced to use it. But what came out of that were quite a few folks who were saying that they were essentially running the predictive coding, the machine learning systems in parallel to their already ongoing linear review, for comparative. They were using it for quality control. There was even a couple of really good stories about savvy buyers who would take a case that was just finished linear review and convince a provider who was trying to sell them a new predictive coding system that, great, load all this stuff up, use the reviewing from this person or this person, these two of my best coders, use them as the seed set, run it against the whole system, tell us what we missed, tell us what we got, tell us how your system would be, and let's see what your system couldn't make a decision on, because that's one of the things I ran into a lot, where people came up and said, yeah, in the sales process, they just didn't bother to tell us that 20, 30+% of the documents we had might not have actually been candidates for clustering. That the system itself, there wasn't enough text in them, or they were too short, or there wasn't enough relationships built. They didn't fall into any of the good clustering categories. So that was one thing. So statistically, and I did see, Tom, that we do have a question on the slides. The slides are currently available off of my website, that you have to be a registered member there to use it. There's no cost. Just take a survey to get it. But if you just send me an email at the end, I'll happily send you a copy set of the slides, anything else you want.
Good.
So rolling back to the survey, the first thing I wanted to do was to validate, to recheck. Question number one is really to kind of recheck and make sure that my statistics for such a small sample set of respondents matched up with the very much larger surveys that use the similar questions. So this question basically is, have you or your clients used machine learning or PC-TAR to review documents? It's pretty much identical to the question found within the recent IGI or the BDO survey, and I believe that the Norton Rose survey as well had one similar, and they all fall in that 80 down to 70% ratio there. So that was good. That was kind of just a validation question for me. The real interesting one was, I got very specific here, and Tammy, this is what you're talking about, is have you relied on the machine learning to make the calls? And essentially what I was asking for is, have you produced out documents here that have not had humans' eyes on them? And so we had 44% that said yes. The interesting part to me is that the 12% of respondents that said that they had used the PC-TAR for relevance and privilege didn't stack up when I got to the interview stage. I went back and specifically chased this down with people who had answered yes on the privilege side, and asked them in interview questions, or just sent them an email and said, you answered this question this way, are you really sure? And the qualified answer on that 12% is that they had used the machine learning to group privilege, but I didn't find anyone in that survey or in discussions since, done a couple of other presentations on this topic, and I've never found anybody who basically stood up and said, I used machine learning to identify privilege, and counsel didn't go back and re-verify every single one of those items. I don't think that's really happening.
And should that happen? And should that happen? Is that the goal?
I think that, again, this is, what is your goal? If you've got 5 or 10 or 100 million items, and you've got 200,000 of those that are quote unquote privileged and potentially relevant, the case itself may not justify a manual review in the proportionality arguments with the new federal rules. So luckily, I'm not an attorney, and I don't have to make that decision. All I have to do is help my clients support the decision that they make and get a practical approach. So to me, the interesting part of those numbers really was this whole concept of, yes, we do have people who are relying on this in cases and matters, but now the question I came back is, I really wanted to differentiate between when are they using predictive coding upstream before, or any kind of analytics before the review, versus using the pure predictive coding during review. And in this question here, what I found was a distinct split, where a small portion of folks were using essentially clustering and doing a lot of, Tammy, this is a lot of your iterative training loops where you're able to categorize and to group things. This is what I would call prioritized review, where the documents are prioritized or even separated out for which documents go straight to counsel, which ones go through the low cost reviewers, et cetera. And there, what I found was a portion of the respondents were doing that for every single case. And then a portion of respondents were coming back and saying, well, only in the very largest cases would we do that. For the smaller cases, we are still just manually just jumping into it and looking through them one by one, which is kind of interesting, but I think that that's a declining number at this stage. And the second stat that we were looking at really was and the key one is what percentage of matters are they're actually using the PC TAR in the review decisions. And here's where we see the big discrepancy between that 80% of people who said, yes, I've used it, but I'm only using it for a much smaller percentage. You can see here that the 0 to 25% of those cases dominates. And if we break that down even a little bit more, it gets even more interesting, because here when you're looking at it, you can see that 36% of respondents said that 5% of their cases is what they were using it on. Most of the people I talked to said really it was 1, 2, or 3 cases a year that was what they were using PC TAR on, not all. And Tammy, how does that match up to what you're seeing out in the ground, in the trenches right now?
Well, first of all, I want to ask you, with respect to that, were we specifically asking if this technology was the use of PC TAR for review decisions, and is that implying without counsel?
In my opinion, that is, but of course the
Okay.
respondents might have interpreted it a little differently. When I talked to my target interviewed folks, they were all fairly confident from the question that they understood that what I was asking them was, what portion of their matters were they willing to use this system on and rely on it for the review decisions, versus what portion of because many of them said, well, 25% of my cases I might use some kind of analytics or predictive coding in my quality control process, but I only use predictive coding to make the initial decisions on relevance in a very small portion of cases. And anecdotally, what they were communicating back was, those are the cases where I don't have a choice. Those are the cases where now. Go ahead.
Okay, so I think what we're seeing, so there's a few things. So I think what we're seeing, first of all, when we've got folks that are calling in and talking to our professional services staff or our support team, obviously they own our Eclipse product, which does include analytics, and so obviously they are a concentrated group of people that are calling in about these things. So we do hear it a lot. We hear a lot from our customers about this, but I find that the use of it and how they apply the results, it's very dependent, again, on the goals of the review, but going through and providing a review team. So you have some folks that will, so like in the example I provided, 5 million documents, that's a ton. And so there are going to be only a few documents in relation to the whole population that really need some really high-level decisions on. And so that's why you hire contract reviewers. They don't know all the same ins and outs of the cases as the partners that are involved, et cetera, in-house. But depending on what the goals are and what we're trying to look at, using technology-assisted review to even just help prioritize the review or put the different rounds of review in the right hands at the given stages in the process, and also depending on their deadlines. They may have certain issues or certain pieces that they have to respond to very, very quickly based on whatever the discovery request is and the deadline of those requests. And so depending on just how granular they need to get. They can use these technologies to get to the core of what they're looking for right away, without having to spend all those hours upon hours upon hours. And so we see people using it in all sorts of ways, depending on their workflow, but with the same goal in mind, which is to reduce the costs. I mean, obviously, reducing the review costs. And so, I mean, I even see a question that's popped up there about the cost with the example that I provided. And the cost for the technology-assisted review piece was really null because they were using Eclipse, and the analytics are included, so they're not paying any type of per gig fee or anything like that. So it was just really the cost of the attorneys that were training the review sets, whereas the cost for the manual review included, the hourly cost associated with the contract reviewers for a month.
So last year,
so I don't have the exact dollars, but that's made a big difference and a big discrepancy between those. But we're actually at some point we're actually working on a case study that will have all the particulars included.
Got it.
Go ahead.
So I'd add to that, Tammy, that in last year's research and interviews, I get some pretty good idea about what were some of the factors that were slowing down or were keeping people from trying, or even if they had tried the predictive coding, why were they not using it on every case? The dollar per gigabyte upcharge that at that time what dominated the industry, because we saw people paying up to $200 extra a gig for the analytics in order to run their predictive coding. That was a major barrier to adoption because it meant that every single case someone had to go to the partners or to the client and had to essentially justify that cost before the review started, before they even knew what was going on with the case. And that was killing the use of predictive coding across the board. Ipro was out front with all-in pricing. You guys had your early agreement with your analytics provider before a lot of the other players did. We are now starting to see all-in pricing options showing up in licensing agreements. We do a lot of RFP support with our clients. It's one of our most common types of engagements. And I would say that probably 50% or 60% of proposals now include all-in analytics in a way that they didn't last year or the year before across the industry. And if the analytics cost, that there's no technology, no per gig cost to be associated with it, the major differentiation in the cost of linear versus predictive coding really is whether or not you're going to need enhanced support during those early matters or expert support to negotiate it with the other side and or defend any potential issues around the training protocols or the confidence levels that you used in your sampling. Those are further barriers that we are seeing to adoption, is this concern of, do I know enough about this technology? Am I comfortable enough about this technology to use it and know when do I stop on the training process? Right. And I would say that my question number 6 was my worst question of the survey this year. I always manage to essentially mess up one question. This question, the way it's phrased, actually is misleading. So it's a poorly worded survey question, in my opinion. What I was trying to get to was essentially, when do you stop training? And in reality, what I was asking is whether or not there was a common agreement out there on the sampling confidence levels, which are part of what goes into that training system. How large are your sample sets? Are you doing, are you training 40 items at a time, or are you training, 3,000 items at a time? Based on, and that's where that confidence level number comes from. So the results of this were interesting to me, but not really solid data or anything I would rely upon, because I think that in the interviews and discussions, it was very, very clear that every single person I asked about this question just came back and said, well, it all just depends. Am I looking at are we using predictive coding on a opposing production to find the most interesting items based on random sampling as we're running around through it? Or are we, using predictive coding in a regulatory request where we have a good quality clawback agreement in effect with the regulators, and we have good confidence that the data that we produce will not be reproduced or sent on to civil plaintiffs or other third parties. Therefore, we can lower the standard of confidence or the level of stability that we want out of our training cycles. How many cycles do we do until we think it's done? How many training rounds does it take to finish a PC Tootsie Roll? I don't think there's any agreement out there yet on this. And I think Tammy, you and I have talked about it. I think you're probably in the same boat with this. Is we don't yet really know when to stop, other than we've done enough rounds and we're not seeing any new data, and we're not seeing any unique items that disagree with the training system. So, I think we may be done with the training system, and now we can get back to that 20% of items that weren't trainable, that are sitting off to the side and couldn't be categorized, and start wading through those. So I think that's really where we've landed in terms of there is no agreement on when to stop yet. This is still a judgment or decision. We do know that people will continue to increase their use of analytics and predictive coding. The CRTL hired the Information Governance Initiative to run a survey, and one of their key elements they were looking for was, are they going to increase spending? And my question, number 4, actually pretty much mirrored it up, that we are indeed, people who've used them are going to continue to use them. It's going to grow bigger. And Tammy, I know from Ipro's perspective, you're looking at people want to use analytics and predictive coding in more ways, not just use it more, but use it differently from how it might have been used before.
Well, that's also debatable. It depends on and this is some of what we're going to be touching on, but there's a lot of misinformation out there. And so we really view, technology-assisted review as an advanced culling technique, like any other culling technique that's out there. And so there's some information out there that suggests that technology-assisted review is to replace the need of attorney review. It's really just a way to better handle the volume of documents, and volume is not always the major factor either. There's a time factor, there's a cost factor, and so on, but it's really an advanced culling technique, and that's really how we treat it.
Got it. And that makes sense from Ipro's perspective, in that you really are addressing what I would call the more recognized, or the pre-review pain point there. An interesting factor I found was that many respondents in questions 2 and 3 were happy to use analytics upstream of review for that prioritized, just like you're talking about, and none of them reported opposing counsel or the bench or the regulators really inquiring after or arguing with them on the use of that clustering technology to cull, to isolate, or to prioritize. Many of them reported a lot of interest and a lot of time and effort spent communicating back and forth when they decided to use machine learning in the actual review process, even if items had already been pre-excluded. And so I always consider that kind of a bit of a technology ostrich syndrome, is don't look upstream, just look at this one little segment there. But the factors of why people use the analytics have changed from last year. My 2014 results we saw some pretty significant differences. Volume or the I have to use predictive coding because I've got such a huge quantity went from number 1 down to number 3 reason just in a year. And the cost as the driver was really the number 1 driver now. It was recognized. Most interesting to me was that my number 5 reason from 2014, which was very much the whole discovery speed, how fast I have to get it done, went from 5 to 2nd. That's some pretty big changes in a 1-year time span. And Tammy, I think it kind of matches up to the whole how quickly can we get our hands around this? How quickly can we organize that data? And it's not always the volume that are the issues.
No, it's always the volume, and the ROI is there for the use of these types of technologies and calling techniques and such. The ROI is there even if you have a 10,000 document set, because it all depends on resources and how many resources you have available to you and what fits the budget for a given review. And so even in the example of a 10,000 document population, if you had to train a set of documents or use sampling for 1,000 or even 2,000, and it resulted in a manual review of another 2,000, that's still 4,000 documents reviewed and 6,000 that didn't have to be because they weren't relevant. So there are a number of different, and everyone has ROI calculators out there, everyone, and you can really create whatever you want, right, for the numbers as a selling point. We really don't try to do that. There are advantages to using these technologies, and it's easy to kind of show that cost benefit, but it goes back to the beginning of what we were talking about, is the practical use of technology based on the goals of the law firm, based on the expertise of the resources available. I know I saw a couple of questions about, can you do it in-house? Sure. I mean, there are technologies out there, including ours, that we really focus on our software to take all the pain out of it, so that it's a better workflow, more automated. Has templates available so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel every single time you have a new case. Just being able to have better usability and even change the way that the workflows are and where culling takes place and how data is staged prior to the review, and that's the main focus. And so I know there's a lot of misinformation out there, and Greg, I know that you feel very strongly about this, but unfortunately sometimes there's a lot of marketing. There's a lot of marketing that tries to lead everyone down one path, or say that one size fits all, or this is always what you can expect, and it's just not true. There are use cases for every piece of technology, and it's important for providers to provide the type of relationship with the users to where they're providing high-level consulting and really educating and being a partner to implement these technologies in a customized way, because it isn't all.
Yeah, and it's not. And I can reiterate. I heard a lot of bitterness and what I would call kind of buyer's remorse, or just post. We went there, we tried it. It was sold to us as one thing. And it worked. It did. The software and the technology did what it was supposed to do, but that wasn't necessarily how it was sold to us. And
right.
The number of times I've sat in on those early RFP presentations by providers who haven't bothered to double check that my clients have brought in an expert, and they've got a poor sales rep who's up there with a slide deck saying that you can review 5,000 items or 1,000 items or whatever it is, and it doesn't matter how big your collection is or what's in the collection, our system will tell you what's relevant, what's not, and what's privileged at that point. And that's just that the market really wanted an easy button, in one sense, for the growing size and complexity of our collections. And there were enough providers and enough sales reps out there who simply just thought that this was an easy button. and they ran it out and sold it that way. And then when people got into it, they found out that, the technologies do work. There's no question about that. And there are quantifiable and solid ROI that I heard across all of my interviews. People do save money, and they do a better job of review using these technologies. But it's not a one-size-fits-all. And you can't walk in. I mean, one of the complaints I heard from a very sharp law firm senior partner in eDiscovery was, their litigation isn't like everybody else's litigation. You can't just walk in and cookie cutter predictive coding for their data and their client's unique IP and the data they're pulling back off of Yammer and the data they're getting from other places. It all requires a level of expertise. And for the person who was asking about, can you use it in-house, the answer to that, in my opinion, is yes, with the right support to set up the initial systems to make sure that you're picking the right technology and the right workflows for your unique data and your unique litigation types, and then to run the validation. You were saying that your clients were spending a lot, using this technology a lot and doing a lot of validation testing. That's
Absolutely.
what we do these days, and I don't see enough of it. This is legal. We trust but verify.
Well, true. And I have a couple, and I wanted to make a couple of comments on two things, and one that kind of goes back to an item you mentioned a few minutes ago. But the two major barriers that I see to the use of technology-assisted review is fear and cost. And so the cost factor you brought up earlier, a couple of different things, and that I think are important to quickly point out, but that the selling techniques and some of the marketing materials around the use of these technologies were pretty aggressive and made some promises. But for what they were charged, what they were being charged, or what the customers were being charged for it, I mean, there had better be some major benefit. So the people who were buying it were really hoping that they were going to get out of it what was being sold to them, because they were paying a premium for that service. I mean, they were paying a premium to utilize that technology. And so with a lot of, not just us, but the others, there are a lot of the tools out there that are including analytics in the tools, so that you're not really paying an additional cost, and it's fixed. You know what you're getting, and it's all wrapped into your review tool capabilities. And in that situation, that removes the cost concern. But that, because there isn't an additional cost, it allows them to utilize technology-assisted review for other processes, just like the QC and things like that. You weren't going to pay some crazy amount of money per gig just to QC your data, so who would do that? So being able to provide included analytics affords the customer the ability to utilize it in other ways that are advantageous for them, depending on the goals of their review. But still, even when the cost factor removed from the discussion, there's the fear. And that goes along with just, like you mentioned, having people on staff with the expertise, or using tools that are easy to use, and have consultants and have professional services consultants that are going to be there to hold your hand through it, or utilizing providers that are able to kind of coach and provide that type of insight into the best practices surrounding the use of these technologies. And I think as someone in that space, that's what we continually argue. I mean, in our company, Ipro always says, when we're asked who's your biggest competitor, we always say we compete against the inefficiencies of eDiscovery. And that's true. So it's about building tools that make more sense, that are more efficient, have templates, have smart workflow, and aren't so scary to the end user. This is no different.
So I'm going to hit one big point out of my perspectives before we kind of move into and at least give folks 10 minutes or so to questions. I've got two quotes in here that were significant enough for me to pull them out. And they're approximate quotes because then I try not to get the exact words all the time with folks. But, partners are not convinced that pushing buttons leads to exhibits and good case prep. Essentially what we're talking about here is that predictive coding was sold really as a solution for responding to a discovery request. But responding to a discovery request and making a production is not the same thing as winning a case or settling a case or resolving a case or arming the party with your client and counsel with the information that they need to make the judgments on the case. And that gets very confusing for many folks because many times these systems are sold as it will bring you the best documents quickest. Well, that's not always true because the best documents are not always what the other side has asked for on there. So I'm distinguishing here, and this is a theme that came up in a lot of the interviews, that senior partners at the law firms are very skeptical of predictive coding. This is one of our barriers. They're like, yeah, it might save the client a bunch of money, but the money that it's saving actually is coming out of our pocket because now I don't have the ability to train 100 associates this year on pure document review, which is, in my opinion, fine because associates should never have been banished to document review for 2 years anyway. But the partners still have their eye on the ball for their job is to win the case. And the use of analytics can actually help them win the case, but only if they think outside of the box it was sold in. You can take that same tool and leverage it to actually do good case prep, but only if you are using it with a decent education there, and we're not seeing that happen nearly as often on there. Mm-hmm. So Tammy, one of our first questions that we had on there was does whether or not, since I'm saying that we're moving to all-in pricing in the market, which is slowly happening, is that really just embedding the marginal increased cost of analytics into the sauce? Basically, I think that what they're asking is, are people hiding the ball and putting right. and putting that $70, $100, $150 per gig into their overall price list? What do you think about it?
I can't speak for everyone, but that's not what we are doing. If you see if anyone has seen our pricing model, that it's apparent that that's not the case. So I think that in most instances, when you do a comparison on the subscription licensing for web-based review tools, it's pretty easy to calculate those and see how items compare. So no, we're not building it in that way, but I can't. I
heard a really interesting story last year when I was doing my interviews on providers, and I got one who basically said, that they offered two different types of predictive coding, one of which was essentially in-house, so there was no analytic cost for them on that, and the second type was, the market-leading predictive coding package with a $200 per gig bump. And in order to be able to compete, he just shrugged his shoulders and said, we essentially just eat the difference if a client wants to use, product X versus product Y. We can't raise the price. I can't go in there and ask them for more. I mean, we have a very competitive market right now. The commoditized cost per gig for processing and hosting is steadily declining. And if anybody in the market thinks that they can continue to bump charge or hide the money, then essentially what that means is that they have some captive clients who haven't bothered to run an RFP in the last year or 3 years. So I think it only applies when people are essentially hiding those numbers, or they have people who just haven't bothered to check the market these days.
Right.
Well, we've got about 5 minutes left, and I want to encourage the audience. Any questions that you perhaps have been holding, please pose them now. And while we're waiting for some of those to come in, there's one question that was asked earlier, and I think we partially covered it, but talking about the major factors inhibiting true predictive coding uptake. No, Tammy, you talked about cost, but are there any other major factors that are inhibiting the uptake?
I mean, Tom, the major factors that I identified, and I think I've got some good ones spelled out in my 2014 report, and they still apply this year. But the big ones there really is the composition of the collections is a major factor that slows people down when they look at their collection and they start realizing that there may not, the clustering just may not really be a good target for that. And it might be, I've heard stories, 5%, I've heard stories that 30 or 40% of the collection just couldn't really be properly clustered into concepts or in ways that were meaningful as an inhibitor. The other thing, frankly, was a lot of pushback at the senior partner level, just folks not wanting to really dive into it. And to me, that's partially a fear that the money is going to go out of their pocket, but it's also just a fear that they themselves are not qualified or comfortable, dare I say, competent to actually run the system, that they don't understand it.
Well, and I think also that there's also the myth out there that it's only for big cases.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And if we're not talking millions of documents, then it's not something that it applies to me. And so I've heard people say that in meetings. Well, our cases, are usually less than 100,000 documents. It doesn't apply to me. So there's some myths to overcome there. And again, I think part of that goes back to, well, is it worth the money? But if the money is not an issue, so there's definitely there's a lot of room to grow here. A lot of room to grow here.
2,500 hours of review for 100,000 documents in the old-fashioned way at $200 an hour is definitely worth contemplating using of another system for it.
Okay. We have a comment, perhaps more than a question. Have you react to it? It says in the project Tammy mentioned, the end client would have not even considered predictive coding had it cost $200 per gigabyte. It was only the free that got attention.
Well, I don't know if that's, for this particular matter, I don't know, with the 5 billion documents, I don't know, I can't comment as to whether or not that was a huge difference, or if it made a difference. I can't say to this particular group, perhaps they would have paid that money because if they saw the value in it, I can't say.
Okay. So I would give an interesting anecdote here. One of my interviews from last year, the only story that I heard of a fairly large enterprise that had moved to 100% required usage of predictive coding analytics. It wasn't necessarily required usage to make every decision, but it was a mandate across the company that every case would be clustered, would actually use some level of analytics on it. Sorry about that, Tammy. Why don't you take over for a sec while I wait for my neighbor to get taken care of?
Okay. There's actually also the cases that folks have used in the past that were very, very large, that came from some of the earlier studies, probably did pay some on a per gig model and still found that they were able to save money, and those are the ones that we see that are the repeat cases, and those are the ones that you see showing up in case studies and white papers and all that. And so it just, the cost issue, again, it continually shows up because that's what it shows up throughout every process within the e-discovery model. I mean, we always say that, e-discovery has been too complicated and too costly for far too long.
Right.
Thank you, and my neighbor did finally find his keys. I think we're probably Tom, about time to wrap up on it.
Yeah, it is. We're at the top of the hour, and I want to thank Tammy and Greg. Great presentation of your findings. Thanks again. I want to remind everyone that there will be a recording of this webinar available shortly on EDRM, Ipro, and Bright Talk websites. And before you leave, please remember to give us a rating of this webinar. And thanks again for attending this EDRM webinar sponsored by Ipro. Everyone have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Tom.